and welcome back to another Make a Code Monday. My name is Martin from the Innisfil Idea Lab and Library, and today I wanted to share with you this interesting boomerang effect that I created in MakeCode Arcade. So rather than a regular projectile that just fires in one direction from your sprite, I've kind of figured out how to make this boomerang sprite fire a certain distance and then return back to the sprite. So it's pretty interesting, and as you can see, there's also a little bit of a simple animation to make it a bit more convincing. So if this looks interesting to you, then let's get started. We'll start by heading over to makecode.com and clicking on Arcade. And then once we're in MakeCode Arcade, we'll click New Project and give our project a name and click Create. So the first thing that we want to do is just get our player sprite on the screen and control them with the directional arrows. So we'll go into the sprites drawer and grab the Set My Sprite block, and you can change it from My Sprite to say like player 1. You can call it whatever you want, something a little bit more descriptive than My Sprite. And then in the sprite image, we're just going to click that. I'm not going to spend any time creating a new character. We'll just go into the gallery and grab one of the pre-made sprites from there and then click Done. So if I refresh, we have our player sprite. Once it refreshes, there we go. And then, so to control this with the directional arrows, we'll go into the controller drawer and then grab this Move My Sprite with Buttons. Change it from My Sprite to player 1 because that's the sprite that we want to control. And then now if I use the directional arrows, I can move my sprite around the screen. So that's great. The next thing we want to do is create our boomerang when the player presses the A button. So to do that, we're going to go into the controller drawer and grab this On A button pressed block. And so on A button pressed, we're going to create our boomerang sprite. So go back into the sprites drawer, grab another Set My Sprite 2 block, and just drag that into there. And then where it says My Sprite, we'll change it to a new variable we'll call boomerang. Click OK. And we have to set the kind, change it from player to projectile, because it's not going to be a player sprite, it's going to be a projectile. So then the next thing we have to do is set the sprite image. Now, remember in the intro, our boomerang is actually going to be animated. So it's actually going to switch between two different sprite images. So what I'm going to do is set a list of images first, and then we'll use that list to populate our sprite image. And so in MakeCode Arcade, a list is called an array. So an array it's similar to a variable, but rather than holding one value, it holds a list of values. So, and they're indexed by like 0, 1, 2, 3, etc. So make sure you click the advanced category so that we can see the arrays drawer, and click that and grab this first block, set list to array, and click on that, and we're going to drag that into our on start block. So we're going to set this list of boomerang images right when the game starts. So right where it says list here, click that and click new variable. So we'll call it boomerang images, which is kind of a long variable name, but it's descriptive. So we'll click OK. And so right now we have an array called Boomerang Images, and right now it's just set to 0 and 1. And you can add more values in your array by clicking this plus or minus button to get rid of them. For our purposes, we're going to have 2 images. So right now where there's numbers, we're going to drag in some images. So also under Advanced, click on the Images drawer. And then under Create, just grab this blank image and drag that into the first value of our array. And then go back and, under Images again, and grab another blank image and drag that into the second value of our array. So the first image is just going to be our boomerang facing one direction. So just create a simple boomerang like so. Great. So facing forward. And so in the second image, it's going to be the same thing, but just facing the other way. So here we go. And now, if you really wanted to animate this like even better, you could actually have like 4 images, so one facing up, down, left, and right, and cycle between those. Feel free to do that. All the logic is pretty much going to be the same. But just to keep it simple, we're going to use these 2 images here. So when we first create the boomerang on button A press, we're going to set the sprite image to just the first value in our array of images. So if we go into arrays under read, we can get this list get value at 0 block. Grab that and then put that into our sprite image block. And so our array is not called list, it's boomerang images. So click that and change it to boomerang images and get value at 0. So arrays, the way they're indexed, they always start at 0. So the first value is going to be 0, and that's this first image here. The next one will be 1. So when we're flipping between them later on, we'll change it from 0 and 1. So great. Let's see what happens now if we refresh and we press the A button. Great. So it creates our boomerang, and it's just there. It's not firing from our character. So that's the next thing that we need to do, is make our boomerang move away from our character. So the other thing we need to do is when it's created, so right now if I move my character down here and I press A, it just creates it here. So the 2 things we want it to do as well is set the initial position to wherever our sprite is and then shoot the boomerang forwards. So all of those blocks to do that are going to be in the sprite drawer. And under physics, we'll grab the set my sprite position to block. And it's the boomerang that we actually want to set the position for. So click my sprite and change it to boomerang. And the position, the X and Y, is going to be wherever the character happens to be on the screen at that time. So we'll have to set that dynamically, and we can do that by going into the sprites drawer, grabbing this my sprite X block, and we'll drag that into the X value and change it from my sprite to player 1. So it's going to set it, the X value, to wherever whatever the X coordinate is for player 1 at that time. And then I can just duplicate this and drag it into the Y value as well. And click this drop down and change it to Y. So now if I refresh and I move my character anywhere, that's where it's going to create the boomerang. So next we want it to fire forwards. So we'll go back into the sprites drawer and then grab, also under physics, this set my sprite velocity block. Drag that in, and we're setting the velocity for the boomerang. So change it to boomerang, and then we just want it to go straight forward. So for the X velocity, we don't want it going left or right at all, so we'll set that to 0. And then Y velocity, remember 0 Y velocity is at the very top of the screen, and then a positive value would send it going downwards. So in order to send it upwards, we want to give this a negative value. So we'll just make it minus 150, and that should be pretty fast. So we'll refresh now. And now when I press A, it fires our boomerang. Okay. So now that we have our boomerang, we want to animate it. So to animate our boomerang projectile, it's actually fairly simple. Remember, we set this array of 2 images, and that's what we're using to set our boomerang image. So when a boomerang is created, we just need to quickly swap the boomerang images to either one of these images and just switch them back and forth, and that'll create kind of an animation, make it look like it's kind of spinning. So to do that, we will go into the game drawer and grab an on-game update every 500 milliseconds block. And I just want to change that from 500 milliseconds to 100 milliseconds. So every 100 milliseconds, we'll run a function that swaps our boomerang image between these 2 images in our array. The only problem running it in this on-game update block is the boomerang doesn't exist until a player presses the A button. So when the game starts, it's gonna run this almost immediately, check for our boomerang variable to animate it, and it won't exist yet, so we'll get an error. So what we have to do is wrap this in an if statement and say only animate the boomerang if it exists. So first we'll create a variable to track whether or not the boomerang exists and whether or not we should animate it. So go into the variables drawer and click on make a variable, and we'll just call this variable animate because it tracks whether or not we need to animate that sprite. Then grab this set animate to block and drag it into the on start block. So when the game starts, there's no boomerang, so we'll set our animate variable to false. So go into the logic drawer, and then under Boolean, grab a false block and set our animate variable to false. Now, when the A button's pressed, of course, we do want to animate it. So let's just duplicate this last block. So I'll right click on it and click duplicate, drag it into our on a button pressed block, and then switch it to true. So when the A button's pressed, we create our boomerang, so we want to animate it, we set that to true. So now we can run or create our if statement to check the value of animate and then either animate it or don't. So go into the logic drawer and grab an if true then block. We'll drag that into our on-game update block. And then we need to set our condition that we're checking for. So go into Logic, and then under Comparison, grab the 0 equals 0 block. Drag that into our condition, and now we just have to populate the values that we're checking. So the first thing is our animate variable. So go into variables, grab the animate block, drag that into the first part of our condition, and then go back to Logic, and under Boolean, grab a true block, and then drag that into the second part of our condition. So if animate is equal to true, it means that they press the A button and a boomerang exists. So we need to animate it. So to do that, we'll just create a function and put it inside this if statement. So go to Functions, and then click on Make a Function. And we already have a variable called animate, so really what this function is going to do is it's going to swap the images. So we'll just call the function swap images. Just type that into here, and then click Done. So we have a function named swap image, and then we have to call it inside of this if statement. So go back into Functions and grab the call swap image block and drag that into the if statement. Now it will call this swap image block when it's appropriate, and we just have to build out our animation code inside of this function. So the way this will work is we'll actually just have an if-else statement, and our condition will be if the boomerang image is set to the first value of our array, which is indexed at 0, then swap the image to the second image. Otherwise, if the image is already the second image, then we'll swap it back to the first image in our array. So go into the logic drawer again and grab this if true, then else statement. Drag that into our swap image function, and we just have to set these conditions. So go into the logic drawer and grab this 0 equals 0 block, drag that into our condition. And so the first thing that we're checking for is the boomerang image. So go into the sprites drawer and then scroll down to image and grab this my sprite image block and drag that into the first part of our condition. And make sure you change this from my sprite to boomerang. And then we're going to check if this is set to the first image in our boomerang images array. So go into arrays, and then under read, grab this list get value at 0 block. Drag that into the second part of our condition. Change it from list to boomerang images, because that is the name of our array. And we actually want to get the value at 0. That's our first image. So we're checking if our boomerang image is set to the first image. If it is, we'll set the boomerang image to the second image in our array. So let's do that in the first part of this if statement. We'll go into the sprites drawer and then back down to images and grab the set my sprite image to block. Drag that in to the if portion of our if else statement. Change this from my sprite to boomerang. And then we want to set the image to the second value of our array. So actually we can just grab this array get value block, duplicate it, and change it from 0 to 1. Remember, arrays start at 0, so 0 is the first, 1 is the second. So otherwise, if our boomerang image is actually the second image in our array, then we'll set it back to the first. So we can just duplicate this whole thing, drag that into the else portion of the if-else statement, and remember we're going to switch it back to the first image, which is at 0. So now, if we refresh this, let's see if this all works. Great, you can see that it's now animated. Now for like a more detailed animation, you could make this a little bit more complicated. You could make this an array of 4 images. So one facing forwards, right, downwards, and left. And then you just have to add more to this if-else statement. But I think this is still pretty good, what we have right now. So the next thing that we need to do is get our boomerang to return to us, because right now, obviously, it's only going forwards. Okay, so let's just think for a second about the logic behind what we want the boomerang to do. So when we press the A button, we create a boomerang sprite originating from our player sprite, traveling upwards with a negative y velocity. And so when the boomerang gets to a certain point, let's say like 50 pixels away from our player sprite, we want it to turn around and return back towards our player sprite. So we're going to need to continuously check for the y position of our boomerang, and if it's 50 pixels away from where our player is, turn around and travel back towards our player. So the calculation for that will be our player 1 position minus 50 pixels. When our boomerang reaches that point, turn around. So we can do this all within this on-game update block. And we're going to need to check for 2 conditions. So, of course, the boomerang position that we were just talking about, but also similar to our animation, we need to make sure that the boomerang exists before we're running this check on its position. Otherwise, we'll get an error. Well, we're already doing that with this animate variable, so we can reuse that. So we're going to create a second if statement here. So go back into the logic drawer, grab another if true then block, and drag it under our first if statement. Now, remember, we're checking for these 2 conditions, and this condition is going to be a lot of blocks to build out, and I think we can just do it faster if we don't do it in blocks, but we do it in JavaScript. So if you haven't explored this feature of MakeCode Arcade, you can actually switch between the block coding and JavaScript. So this is what everything we've written so far looks like in JavaScript. So you can see actually our on-game update block is actually right here. And we have that first if statement. You can see the condition is in these rounded brackets here, if animate is equal to true. And here's where we're calling our swap image function. And then here is that second if statement we just created. So rather than like dragging all these blocks out, we can just write in our condition here. And so it's not that complicated. we're just going to type out the words instead of using blocks. So our first condition is going to be checking if animate is equal to true. So if animate is equal to, and when we're checking if something is equal to something, we're comparing it, we use a double equal sign in JavaScript. So if animate is equal to true, we just type in the word true. That's our first condition. But we also need to check for the Y position of our boomerang. So we're going to type in and to do that in JavaScript, we just type in a double and symbol. So if animate is equal to true, and if our boomerang Y value, so to check that, we type in boomerang dot Y. And then we want to check if our boomerang Y value is less than whatever our player 1 Y value minus 50 is. So, and boomerang dot Y is less than player 1, that's our player 1 sprite, dot Y minus 50. So if animate is true and our boomerang Y value is 50 pixels away from where our player currently is, then we're going to return the boomerang back to the player. So let's look, after we've written this out, let's go back into blocks and see what this looks like. So go back into blocks here. And then now if we go back to this on-game update, we can see our if statement with all that whole condition, and it's a lot of blocks. So that's why I just wanted to type it out. It's a lot faster, and it shows you how you can write. You can kind of switch between JavaScript and blocks. And if you don't really like writing in JavaScript, you can just feel free to build this condition out in blocks as well. And the other thing I'll show you really quickly is you can also switch from JavaScript to Python. So this is what that whole thing looks like in Python. You can see we don't use brackets, just spaces and indenting, but the condition pretty much looks the same. So anyways, enough of that. Our next step is actually turning our boomerang around. So this part is really easy. We can just tell our boomerang to start following our sprite. So if we go into the sprites drawer, and then down under physics, there's this set my enemy follow my sprite block. So let's go and drag that into our if statement. And I think this is usually used if you have like an enemy sprite and you want it to like follow your character. But we're using it for this boomerang, so we're going to change this from my enemy to boomerang. And we want to follow our player 1. So change that to player 1. And remember the speed of our boomerang up here is negative 150 pixels per second. So we actually want it to be just positive 150 per second because it's going downwards. That's a positive Y value. So let's try this out. If I press the A button, there we go. But you can kind of see a funny thing that happens. Once it returns to the sprite, or our player sprite, it still exists, so it's just kind of like attached to me now. So what I want to do is set it so that when the boomerang returns to the character, just destroy it. So this is pretty easy. We've done this a lot in our other videos. We can go to the sprites drawer and then down to overlaps. We can grab this on sprite of kind player, overlaps other sprite of kind player block, drag that under the rest of our code. And so we want to detect if our player overlaps another sprite with a kind of projectile, because our boomerang, we set it to a projectile. Then we can just go into the sprites drawer, and then under effects, grab this destroy my sprite, and just change that my sprite to you can say boomerang, or just grab this other sprite block here and replace that. So the other sprite in this case is going to be that projectile. So if I run this now, we can see something weird happens. The boomerang just appears, but it immediately gets destroyed before it comes back to the player. Well, what's happening is when we create our boomerang, we immediately set its position to our player one's position, because we want it to look like it's coming from our player. But what that means is that immediately it's overlapping right from the beginning, and so this overlap detection sees that and it destroys it immediately. So there's probably a few different fixes to this, but what I kind of figured out was we can create another variable that just checks if a boomerang is brand new, so like right when it's created, and if that's the case, don't run this code that tells it to destroy it. And then we can set that value to false maybe once the boomerang is 50 pixels away from the player, because we already have that code in this if statement. If that's the case, set it to false, and then we can tell it to destroy the sprite if it overlaps our player. So we are going to create this variable in the on button A pressed block. Go into variables and then click make a new variable. And we're just checking if the boomerang is like new or if it's old, so we'll call it this variable is new. And click OK. And then grab the set is new block, drag it under our set animate to true block, and then go into logic, Boolean, and grab this true. So when the boomerang is created, it's new. So we'll set our is new variable to true. So then when the boomerang gets sent back, we'll set this to false. So in our on-game update block, in this statement where we're telling the boomerang to come back and follow the player, we'll set our is new variable to false. So go back into variables, set is new, drag that in, and under logic, grab a false block, and we're going to set it to false. So now we'll only run this destroy the other sprite, our boomerang block, if is new is set to false. So go into the logic drawer, grab an if statement, drag our destroy other sprite block into that, and let's build out this condition. So we could go back to JavaScript and do this, but this one's pretty simple. So we can just do it with the blocks. go into the logic drawer, grab this 0 equals 0 block, and then under variables, grab the isNew variable, drag that into the first part of our comparison, and then under logic and Boolean, grab a false block and drag that in. So now this will only run if our isNew variable is equal to false. Let's refresh this and see if it works. There we go, our completed boomerang effect, and I think it looks great. So it's quite a bit of code to get this working, obviously, but I think it's a pretty cool effect. And you could still make this even better. The code would just be a little bit more complicated. So you can make this array of images, 4 images facing like left, right, top, and bottom. And then in our swap image function, you would just have 4 different conditions. The other thing you could do is track the direction that your player's facing and set the boomerang to fire in different directions based on where the player is facing. Lots of other things you could probably do, but I think this was enough for today's tutorial. So I hope you enjoyed watching this video. I hope that you learned something, and most importantly, I hope you have a great day. Thanks.